start recording?
Yeah, we're going to record this for people who couldn't come. It's such an important issue that we all need to talk about in a calm, rational manner from the perspective of nonviolence. And so, David, would you like to introduce Steve Chase?
Why don't we just start with a couple of moments of silence?
Okay. All right. So yeah, let's start with a moment of silence.
I think it's a great privilege to have Steve Chase with us today, electronically at least, who is a member of the Friends Meeting in Washington and also the Quaker Palestine Israel Network. He has served as an interfaith ally of the DC chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. He's the author of the Pendle Hill pamphlet, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, a Quaker Zionist Rethinks Palestinian Rights. He is currently working on a book entitled Seeking Justice in the Holy Land, The Evolution of Quaker Perspectives on Israel and Palestine. And Steve is also the Cadbury Scholar at Pendle Hill this year. The title of his talk today is Why Peace with Justice? Reflections on a Quaker Delegation to Israel and Palestine. Welcome, Steve. So glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you, San Francisco Friends, for inviting me to speak with you and to worship with you earlier. That was so meaningful to me. And for people who aren't attenders or members of Friends Meeting, I want to welcome you as well, because this is a time for people of good faith, goodwill, and good trouble to discern together what is a faithful, moral, and strategic response to the crisis we're in. And I hope my talk can provide some context and some help in thinking this through. And I'm really looking forward to the question and answer part and a dialogue. So let me just share my screen. So as David said, Why Peace with Justice? Reflections on a Quaker Delegation to Israel and Palestine. And every year, barring a couple during the COVID crisis, Friends United Meeting organizes a service learning trip to Israel and Palestine, usually in the summer. In our case, it was June 6th to 25th, 2023. The picture on the right is our delegation at the Ramallah Friends Meeting with a number of our Palestinian hosts, and it was very moving to be there. I have to say at the outset of this talk that the 3 weeks that I spent in Israel, Palestine were the most life-changing, gut-wrenching, heartbreaking, inspiring, and spiritually deep weeks I've spent in my entire life, and I've had a really good life. I heartily recommend people considering applying next year or the year after that and going with the leaders Max and Jane Carter. Now, when I came back, I felt like I had a responsibility to talk about what I saw. And that was well before October 7th. The moment is a bit different now, a lot different in many ways. And so to start, before I talk about my trip in June, I want us to just take a few moments to share a silent prayer together for the suffering of the living and dead in Israel, Palestine since October 7th. Thank you, friends. I want to tell a story about a couple who were married under the care of Friends Meeting of Washington just about a year ago. The husband is a Jewish Israeli American, a proud liberal Zionist who hates the occupation, wants greater justice and peace, but loves Israel and loves what it means. And he's married to a woman whose father became a convinced Quaker when he went to the Ramallah Friends School. Palestinian man, was originally Greek Orthodox and felt more at home with Quakers after his experience at the Ramallah Friends School. And they have been sharing since October 7th their pain and their struggle, including in their marriage. And the husband has explained to many in meeting that he has an easier time empathizing and suffering with and caring about the 1,200 Israeli civilians that were slaughtered by the Hamas military operation on October 7th and the 240 captives that were taken in to Gaza. And he admits so honestly that he gets that the people of Gaza are now suffering mightily, but it's a bit abstract. It's a bit hard for him to fully open his heart. And his Palestinian American wife has shared very profoundly the reverse situation of she feels the searing pain of the suffering of the Palestinian people of Gaza and on the West Bank, which doesn't get enough attention right now. And she wants to feel pain and suffering for the Israeli civilians, but it's a bit abstract. And they've talked together and they've talked together and they've reached out for help from our Friends Meeting. And they have each deepened their hearts to embrace the suffering and the love for all the innocent people who've been suffering so mightily since the 7th. And this leads me that even if we have differences about policy or analysis or strategy about how to move forward, I believe we have a common moral ground. And I want to share the spiritual wisdom of a Palestinian village priest that we visited in June in a small little village. And what he said was, it doesn't matter whether your name is Moshe, Mohammed, or Matthew. You are all precious in the eyes of God. And everyone deserves to live with peace, security, equality, and justice. And I just want to start this presentation with saying amen.
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 I want to talk a little about my grounding as a Quaker peace activist. And I went back to our roots and found a quote that's very meaningful to me now in this moment by Edward Burrow, who was a friend in the mid-1600s. And the first part of his quote goes, "We are not for names, nor men, nor titles of government. Nor are we for this party or against that other because of its name and its pretense." And here we have in the mid-1600s somebody saying how easy it is to get caught up in the surety of your position and trying to rhetorically win or outmaneuver other people or even engage in violence against them to win and to demonize them and not listen to them. And it's so easy to do. But I think part of Quaker faith is to try to go to a deeper level as we're engaging in our communities and trying to develop policies and norms and laws that move forward. And then the second part of what he said I find so meaningful. He first says what we're not for, and then he says, but we are for justice and mercy and truth and peace and true freedom, that these may be exalted in our nation. Now, another part of why I wanted to even go to Israel and Palestine is that there's a long tradition of Quakers caring about people, the Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and sort of secular people who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And I'm learning more as part of my research for the book about how Quakers supported persecuted Jews in Europe. The German yearly meeting during the rise of Nazi power in Germany refused to say Heil Hitler. They were the only denomination to refuse to turn in lists of their members to the government that had Jewish ancestry. When the Nazis started boycotting Jewish businesses to destroy Jewish livelihood and make life hard, the Quakers went out of their way to buy from Jewish-owned shops. And British Quakers and US Quakers pushed for mass immigration for safety of persecuted Jews, particularly in the US and the UK. And they failed because of the anti-Semitism in their own countries and the bias against immigrants. But they also helped facilitate not only some members who were persecuted coming to the US and the UK, they also, I know that the American Friends Service Committee worked to help relocate some Jews to Palestine. Quakers also have a long history in Palestine that predates the founding of Israel in 48. The Ramallah Friends School, which I've mentioned, was started by Friends in 1869. On the right is a picture of the Ramallah Friends meeting, which this building was built in 1910, and it housed a small but a growing for a long time meeting of Friends, and was a place for internationals to come as well. At the First World War, it was taken over by the British Army and it was turned into an officer's bar, but they gave it back after the war, and it has been a Quaker meeting house ever since. The UN also invited Quakers to aid Palestinian refugees in 1948, after 3/4 of the Palestinian population in what was to become Israel were pushed out and made refugees. And the Friends Service Committee and the British equivalent worked very hard in Gaza, helping with the refugees for 2 years until they gave the responsibility back to the UN, which was now prepared to handle it. Quakers have been visiting and seeking justice in Israel and Palestine ever since. These are 3 books from 3 different decades that have been published by the American Friends Service Committee. But besides being a Quaker, I'm also a US citizen. And so I've been paying attention that human rights groups throughout the world, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights group, have analyzed the situation between the river and the sea and the amount of authority that the Israeli government has, even in the occupied territories. And they're claiming this rises to the level of the crime of apartheid under international law. And this is done with US backing. And that rivets my attention. Now, some people don't love the term apartheid for describing this situation. And part of the confusion is that South Africa had a very specific type of apartheid, but there are many types of apartheid. In South Africa, it was a small minority that wanted to maintain a large subordinate population that they could exploit for labor. It's a little different in Israel Palestine because it's a much bigger group rather than a small minority, about equal size to the Palestinians, but not just wanting to exploit them, but also wanting to displace them and have the maximum amount of land taking over of historic Palestine with as few Palestinians in it as possible. And under international law, there are three elements, and you can see them here, that define whether something happens to rise to the level of the crime of apartheid. That Israel and its US backers are not the only system that have an intent to maintain domination in the context of systematic oppression and inhuman acts. And yet, Israel gets the most diplomatic cover from the United States. And since 1948, it has received the most military support of any country in the world. So it's an important one to focus on. So we went to see for ourselves. And I just want to say, focus on the three defining things, whether you like the term apartheid or not. But we wanted to see for ourselves, is this really operating? And this is an older map of Palestine and part of Israel. And it was, I think, made before 2006, because currently, if you look at the green, it suggests that Gaza is under Palestinian authority to some extent after the Oslo agreements. But after 2006, Hamas took over in a fairly violent way and kicked the Palestinian Authority out of Gaza. But this gives you a sense of where we were. We went to Ramallah, Jericho, Bethlehem, Nablus. We visited many towns and villages in between these major population centers. We came in through Tel Aviv, spent a lot of time in Jerusalem, and spent time in the north of Israel, even going to the Israeli-Lebanese border to visit a kibbutz there. So on the road, we at least had a sense of the separation. The wall is massive, it's militarized, and it barricades the two communities, the occupied territories, and it takes over much of the land of the occupied territories and then Israel. I was a little surprised to see this big red sign, which says it is illegal for Israeli citizens to go to the larger cities, which are so-called Area A in the occupied Palestinian territories. The unfortunate thing here is that means Palestinians in the occupied territories, the only Jewish Israelis that they tend to have encounters with are violent, religious, fanatical settlers on their land and Israeli occupation military forces. But we got through the checkpoints and got to Ramallah, and we settled into what is a remarkable oasis in the middle of Ramallah, which is the Ramallah Friends School. 1,600 students. There's 2 campuses, a lower school for the lower grades, and then an upper school about a mile away, which is where we stayed for the upper grades. And throughout the campus, you can see these posts that are here in the middle that have different testimonies of friends, explained in English and in Arabic, of peace and equality. And it's a really moving place to be. And they have had a very positive impact on developing leaders and professionals and NGO folks that are doing hard work under amazingly difficult circumstances. And our trip leaders, this is my big Valentine to Max and Jane Carter. Max has been going to Israel, Palestine since 1970, almost every year. And once he and Jane got married, they started doing it together in the 90s. They started a ministry of leading trips of Guilford students at Quaker College and also leading trips for Friends United meeting. They are incredibly knowledgeable. They are kind, they are wise, and they were amazing leaders. They also represent how Quakers have this long history in the Holy Land. Max's great aunt Annis started working at the Friends School in Ramallah in 1929, long before the State of Israel came to be. She worked there until 1965, retired, came back to the United States, where she lived in Indiana. And after the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel occupied the rest of historic Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, she was asked back to help them with her institutional memory, navigate the transition of how do you run a Friends school under military occupation. Their daughter is a scholar on nonviolent resistance by Palestinians against the occupation and has done remarkable work and been there many times for research. So we had a lot of meetings and site visits, but it wasn't just that. 3 mornings out of the 3 weeks we were there, we did service projects for the Friends School. In this case, this is the now clerk of the Atlanta Friends meeting, one of the people on the delegation who was painting benches in a courtyard. And we did just the work that needed to be done. The other thing is, at night, we often stayed with families of students from the Ramallah Friends School or students who had gone to Guilford College and had been sort of nurtured by Max and Jane as their US surrogate parents. And so this was very meaningful. It also meant we got up very early and often went to bed very late, but we got to be with many families in Palestine, and that was meaningful. But we also had lots of meetings. The day was filled with meetings, and Jane would sometimes laugh and say, "We'll sleep when we get home." One of a really interesting meeting, a friend of Jane and Max's, which is kind of amazing, is the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, which has its offices currently in Ramallah. And he was fascinating because he is a part of Palestinian leadership that pretty fundamentally opposes the ideology, the strategies, and of Hamas. And they are in a difficult position, which we'll discuss a little more, but he really believed that we have to, that the Palestinians, with the help of global civil society and hopefully someday actual help from the United States, would be able to combine diplomacy and nonviolent resistance to a system of apartheid and military occupation to create freedom and equality for everyone who lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And at one point, one of our delegation, Maria, who is a Methodist minister, said, oh, when he had said something about violence only begets violence and funerals only beget more funerals. And she said, well, from your lips to God's ear. And he laughed. And I just, for a moment of lightness, he said, well, here in the Holy Land, that's a local call. He also talked about the difficulties because there's ways the PA is very compromised by being in a security agreement with Israel, because Israel collects the taxes that they use for security and all their social programs. And they often don't give back to the Palestinian Authority all the money that they collect in Palestinian taxes. And so this is part of where it gets difficult, and they compromise, and they probably don't do, and I would say they don't do a good enough job providing security and safety for their people because of being compromised by Israel in that way. But they're sincerely trying. Two other things he said that I think are important. He said, why is it that once Russia occupies the eastern portion of Ukraine, the US mobilizes the world community and throws massive amounts of money to end that occupation, when Israel has been occupying Palestine for over 56 years? It troubles us, that hypocrisy. And he also brought up his huge disappointment with the Biden administration because they have been the only presidential administration in decades that hasn't even pretended to have a peace initiative for Israel and Palestine. So that was an important meeting. Then we met with Hannah Ashrawi. She's a dissident leader. She left the PLO and the PA. She thinks that they are too compromised by Israel, that they have some corrupt cronyism, that they have become too undemocratic, and they need major reform. And she started a civil society group that is trying to build capacity of Palestinian people in the occupied territories to develop civic initiatives that can democratize Palestine and help end and take initiatives to end the occupation and apartheid. She also she was one of the leaders of the first Intifada, which was largely nonviolent civil resistance. And she became the head of the Palestinian negotiation team in the Madrid conference. And she talked about how she felt a bit betrayed by the PLO because they were the leadership was in Tunisia at this time. This would have been in the early 90s. And her strategy was, let's solve all the problems: right of return, the status of Jerusalem, the independence and the creation of a Palestinian state. The PLO, in secret, sent 2 representatives who hadn't lived in the occupied territories for decades to have secret negotiations with the Israelis. And they left all those important questions and it was just sort of administrative. Yes, the PLO can come back and base themselves in Ramallah. And it divided Palestine. Like if you look at the West Bank, I think 62% of it is called Area C. And that is under complete military and civil control of Israel. The majority of the West Bank is still because of the Oslo Agreement. Then there's Area B, And that is another big portion of it, which is under military control of Israel, but they allow the Palestinian Authority to have some civil responsibilities. And then there's Area A, which is, 5 or 6 larger cities and concentrations of Palestinian populations, where supposedly there is the security and military affairs and the civil affairs are controlled by the Palestinian Authority, but it's not quite like that. She was also brilliant and really studied the history of Jewish political Zionism, and she quoted several people that was really enlightening. And she did one quote that I had heard before when a progressive Jewish friend of mine sent it to me years ago after he had visited Israel for a long time. And I want to share it with you here because this is the context we're dealing with. So Moshe Dayan was Minister of Defense. He started just a few days before the Six-Day War and the completion of the military occupation of the last 22% of historic Palestine. And he gave a speech, and rhetorically he was speaking to Palestinians. And this is what he said to Palestinians back in 1967. We have no solution. You shall continue to live like dogs. And whoever wishes may leave, and we will see where the process leads. We have been seeing where the process leads ever since. We had a meeting with Sam Bahor, and I'll just try to go quickly over this because I think I'm taking longer than I should. But he was a Palestinian American businessman who felt some hope with the Oslo Accords, and he read it over and over again, and he found that he was a telecommunications specialist, and there was something in the Oslo Accords that talked about an independent telecommunications system for Palestine. And so he moved to Palestine, he brought his technical expertise, and he worked hard. And he was thwarted by Israel over and over again. They wouldn't grant the necessary sort of, I don't know the technical thing, but the waves, the slots, the bandwidth or whatever. And it cost Palestine 3.5 times more than it would have had they been more generously receiving the support that the Oslo Accords suggested would happen. He also talked about just the institutional red tape of the occupation. He applied for a card, an identity card, to be a full-time person in Palestine. It took him 15 years to get it. 15 years of applying. He had every 3 months to go to Jordan, to cross a bridge into Jordan, and to have his temporary 3-month visitor visa stamped and then go back to Ramallah. And he did this 4 times a year, 15 years. And he talked about many other restrictions where the occupation gets in the way of full equality, freedom of movement, and things. And if there's questions about that, I'll go into more detail. We also visited a Muslim family on the outskirts of the Haja village, and there's so much I would like to say about this family. They were amazing hosts, but they lived in Area C, and you can see their house. And it has the beginnings of a 2nd floor, but the Israeli officials in Area C, which controlled military and civil, came to them and said if they add 1 more brick to build the 2nd floor, they would blow up the entire house. And this is very common. This is very, very common. It's policy. We also spent time outside of Bethlehem, and after going to a refugee camp outside of Bethlehem, we went up to the hill to the Tent of Nations Organic Family Farm. And this was a beautiful place. It's an organic farm, about 100 acres on the top of a hill. And we listened to I think the grandson of the original owner of the farm in a cave that his grandfather had dug out as a place to live when he first came and took ownership. And he was telling the story that under the Ottoman Empire, he bought it over 100 years ago. He registered it with the Ottoman Empire. And then in, I think, 1917, 1918, when the British Mandate happened, he registered the property with the British Mandate government. And then after 1948, and Jordan took over this part of historic Palestine, he registered it with the Jordan authorities, had no problem. After 1967, when the occupied territories were under the full control of Israel, he tried to register it, and that was in 1967. He has still not been granted by Israeli courts the right to his own land. He goes to court and spends thousands of shekels every year trying to get it, and he's trying to hold on to this precious family farm. They are committed to nonviolence. They do programs for children and international volunteers. They quote the Bible. They're a Palestinian Christian family, and they are hanging on by a thread. They are surrounded by, on the hills around them, by 5 Israeli settlements. Their crops have been burned by settlers. Settlers come on their land with guns and saying, God gave this land to the settlers, and they will eventually get rid of the farm and the family. As we traveled around, we noticed that there were settlements everywhere in areas B and C, and they had full electricity, great water, really nice housing. They're all segregated communities. You usually can only get them on segregated Jewish-only roads in the West Bank. And then there's a picture of the water towers on a Palestinian village on the left, and then you can see the settlement high on the hill. And there's been a recent report. If anybody wants to know the specifics, I'd look it up. I'm drawing a blank right now, but there was a very thorough research report that says that the settlements use at least 3 times as much water as is available to the Palestinian residents of the West Bank. And one of the things I would say about Tent of Nations, they are not allowed to have running water. They rely on their well and catching rain. They are not allowed to connect to an electric grid. They have to use solar panels that were generously donated by Solidarity folks in Europe. They are not even allowed to build new buildings. And this is just an example of institutional, what I think rises to the level of apartheid. Now I'm going to get into a harder thing of it's not just institutional, but it involves violence. We met Shadi Khoury, a student at Ramallah Friends School, who a year before had 40 IDF soldiers broke into his family's home in the middle of the night in occupied East Jerusalem, pointed guns at the entire family, his grandmother, his father, his mother, his siblings. They dragged him out of the house. They beat him in front of the house while the guns were on the family to keep them from trying to help him. They took him to prison. They didn't charge him with anything. They eventually moved him to a prison up north in Israel, in Haifa, because his parents did not have permits to visit him. He was beaten in prison when he sang a Christian hymn to keep his spirits up. They finally charged him with vandalizing a car during an anti-occupation demonstration. He claims he didn't do it, but think about what is the extent of his crime that all this happened to him, even if he did it, which his faculty members don't believe, and his family is very committed to nonviolent resistance. But even if he did, is this warranted for vandalizing a car? He was brought to court. The 15-year-old, the only witness against him, who had in a statement said he had seen Shadi do this, recanted his testimony on the stand, said he was beaten in prison because he was also under administrative detention, and he was told he would never get out unless he did false testimony against Shadi. And he recanted it, said he doesn't know Shadi, he had never seen him before, and he did not witness the crime. Instead of the case being dismissed, Shadi was put on home arrest, which he still lives under. So he can go from his home in East Jerusalem, as long as he has a family member with him, to go to school and then go back home. And he can't go anywhere else without the risk of being thrown into prison. I asked Shadi, excuse me, I asked Shadi how he managed to sustain himself through all of that. And he said many things: a supportive family, his faith, his teachers and fellow students encouraged him. And then he said, and this was heartbreaking to me, and at least I got off better than George Floyd. Shadi also shared how his arrest and torture is like many other Palestinian children, that his experience is not uncommon. It is policy. When I got back in July, I noticed that Save the Children International published a report with detailed research of what happens to children in the Israeli prisons. And it backs up his claim. About 500 to 750 children every year their homes are broken into by IDF soldiers, usually in the middle of the night. These are some statistics from this study. It's too much time to go through it, but it shows policy and harshness. And these are also hostages. That was much on our minds. We went to bed. The next morning, we woke up to bomb explosions and gunfire about a mile away from the upper campus, but it was about 3 blocks from the lower school. So we went down and talked to the principal at the Ramallah Friends School, and she burst into tears. And she said, I'm sorry, so many things like this have happened to me. It triggers me every time. It's so common. And she said there was a house demolition just a few blocks from the school, and that her son had been in the restaurant below the apartment that was blown up. And 100 IDF soldiers came in and were shooting and planted the munitions, the bombs that blew up the apartment. And finally, her son, when it calmed down a little, walked out with his hands up, and he shouted to the soldiers, please don't shoot. I'm a Christian. I just want to go home. And 5 soldiers pointed their guns at him and said, you better run. He got home, she held him, they cried, and then she goes to school. School was canceled for the first half day because the tear gas in the neighborhood was so harsh. Our group went the 3 blocks from the lower school. And here's a picture of, you can see on the second floor, the blown out apartment. And you can see the restaurant below it that her son was trapped in when 100 IDF soldiers. We were talking to children and people on the street, getting their impressions of what happened. And then we had the good fortune to meet up with 2 Palestinian journalists filming and interviewing eyewitnesses. And the man on the right, Asraf, is a graduate of the Ramallah Friends School and a close family friend of Max's and Jane. And he filled us in about the whole policy of house demolitions and how it happens even in Area A. So what happens is Israel's military calls the Palestinian Authority and says, we're going to invade Ramallah and we're going to blow up a house. You need to get your police and security forces out of the neighborhood. The PA complies, does not protect the citizens of Palestine. And then they come in and they often shoot, they blow up the house, and they blow up a house of people who might be charged or merely suspected with a crime. And this is collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. Asraf also told us that during the shooting, 2 journalists clearly marked were shot by the IDF forces, and that this is common and arguably policy. One was shot in the stomach and was doing okay. One was shot in the head and was in the ICU with severe brain damage. And we never heard the final story on what happened to that journalist. These are pictures of the kids cleaning up the apartment after the explosion. And then this, when I looked up and I saw them putting this plant on the sill, and it just moved me so much what these kids have to live through. And then this sweet gesture of life. And there's an Arabic word called samud, which means steadfastness and resilience. And I was very moved by this small act of samud. We went to visit Hawara, which some of you may have heard about. After the new government in Israel took power in January, the most extreme right-wing, openly racist, and making several ministers making expressions of genocidal intent. This emboldened violent right-wing Jewish settlers and extremists and religious fanatics, and they started attacking various villages in the West Bank. And Hawara was one of the worst in February, and we went to investigate. And these are pictures of when over 250 settlers, protected by Israeli occupation forces, attacked the village of Hawara. They burned houses, they burned cars, they shot into homes, they were screaming death to Arabs. And we talked with the mayor, and then the woman on the right who's speaking so passionately was the municipality's public relations person. And they described the stories, and she was describing the trauma of the children in the village and the surrounding villages, and how even if their houses weren't completely burned, they didn't want to go back inside. It is so rough there. And I had read about things, but you can't imagine what it's like to hear people tell the stories. That same day, we were going to go to Jenin to visit the refugee camp there. But that day was the first Israeli airstrike in the West Bank in 20 years. And they were attacking the refugee camp. They also had tanks in there. There was firefights back and forth by armed self-defense militias among some Palestinian youth. And it was, there was no way we could go under these circumstances. A day later, passing a road that we were on just the day before, we heard that 2 Palestinians, after the attack on the Jenin camp, shot and killed 4 Israeli settlers on Highway 60 at a convenience store and a gas station, which we had stopped in the day before. It was pretty horrendous. 4 people lost their lives at the hands of these Palestinians, and the 2 Palestinians were killed. The day after that, we were meeting with Mustafa Barghouti, who is an amazing Palestinian leader. He gives me so much hope about what the future could bring. He ran for president on a new political party that distanced itself both from Hamas and from the dominant party Fatah in the Palestinian Authority. And it has a 3-pronged program to end the occupation in the system of apartheid, to democratize Palestinian society, and work for social justice for the poor and women and marginalized minorities. And he co-founded this party with Edward Said that many people might know. He's also the director of the Palestinian Medical Relief Society. And we were talking about healthcare disparities. And he said that cancer is a significant health problem in the West Bank, but there is not a cancer facility in the West Bank. And you have to go to a hospital in Jerusalem to get care. He also said that Israel refuses to give permits to 40% of Palestinian cancer patients. The 60% of the cancer patients they do have to go through many checkpoints and being patted down, and they can go to the hospital, and then they come back through checkpoints, but they have to pay 4 times as much as an Israeli citizen would have to pay for the same care at the same hospital. Now, he kept getting phone calls in the middle of this. This is the day after the settlers were killed and 2 days after the attack on Jenin. And I was kind of miffed. I was going, we set up this time to talk. Why are you taking phone calls in the middle of it? I was naive and selfish. He told us after about the 3rd call, "I'm sorry for the interruptions, but we keep getting reports of more and more violent settler attacks on Palestinian towns and villages today. So far, we have heard from 50 Palestinian communities on the West Bank that have been attacked by armed settlers." I also minimized that. In my head, I was thinking, well, he probably is just speaking in general, and he means a lot. That night, when I was reading online the Israeli daily newspaper Haaretz, they reported that 85 different communities were attacked by settlers in that one day. And it's not only, the violence is not only a response when some Palestinians cross the line into offensive violence and attack settlers. We went to the Tamimis in a very little village. And these are people who have thought about, do we resist violently? And they have decided for decades to resist the occupation nonviolently. And so it was great to see them. This is a checkpoint that we had to try to go through to get to them. And there's 600 checkpoints that are official and block Palestinian freedom of movement in their own territory. But this is a flying checkpoint that just shows up now. And just a few days before, soldiers at this checkpoint started firing into a car of an unarmed Palestinian family, wounding everybody in the car and killing a 2.5-year-old. We almost didn't go to the Tamimis because the wife of the couple had been at a demonstration mourning the death of this child and opposing the occupation, and she was beat up by Israeli occupation soldiers and rifle butts to the head. She is a nonviolent activist. We sat with them, and Naarman and Basil talked about their nonviolent struggle in their tiny village of 500 over the water rights that have historically been theirs, but the spring and the water sources have been taken over by Israeli settlements that have grown up on the hills around them. Basil and I had fun because the same nonviolent action theorist author that has been so central to each of us, Gene Sharp, was in, so we just bonded over that, and he knew a bit about my organization earlier of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. Everyone in their family has been to prison more than once for their nonviolent resistance. Their son was shot in the leg when he was doing a nonviolent demonstration at the spring by a sniper. Basil has been in prison 9 times in the 90s. He was tortured viciously. This is policy. Many of you may have heard the famous case of his daughter. In 2017, Ahed Tamimi was photographed slapping an Israeli soldier. I've seen the TV reports in Israel, and it says this brave soldier was attacked viciously by this teenage girl who slapped him on the face in an unprovoked manner. What it didn't say was the soldier had just shot her cousin in the head with a rubber bullet and caused him brain damage. He spent no time in prison. She spent 8 months in prison for being so angry in that moment that she slapped a soldier. Now I'll try to move things forward. Let me just check the time. Oh my gosh. I will try to hurry. I'm sorry. It is hard to take the 3 most intense weeks of your life and cut it down to an hour. And I thought I was getting there, but I'm struggling here. So, but anyway, we went to Jerusalem, and then we went on to visit Israel. One of the things that we met with, and this was so beautiful, the first ordained Palestinian woman in Israel and Palestine. She is in the old city of Jerusalem at the Church of the Redeemer. It's a Lutheran church. She did her theological training in Germany, and she came back to serve Palestine. She said something, there's so many things she said, but she said something that as a kid, her family had been displaced in 1948. And as a kid, they would go, there was a game of, well, if we get kicked out yet again from East Jerusalem, what would you take with you? And then she said that her family all have go bags. They are packed and ready to run at a moment's notice. And again, I'm going, okay, I can understand why you might think that because of your history in 48, but that seems a little far-fetched. That very week in Haaretz newspaper, it was reported that Benjamin Netanyahu, in a private meeting of his ministers, reported that 20 battalions of the IDF have been specifically trained to go into all-out war against the 20% of Palestinians, citizens of Israel, if it ever becomes necessary. And so her worries and packing ahead is not weird. It's practical under the policies. When we went to the Kibbutz Ner, and we talked to an Israeli Special Forces guy, and we talked to several Jewish Israelis who were much more liberal than this guy, but he also lived on a commune, and the kibbutz was moved by sort of egalitarian, social, democratic, socialist doctrines. He does some really rough stuff in Syria and Lebanon and on the West Bank. I think he's been to Gaza before. And yet even he said the current government is abysmal and dangerous. And he also said, as much as he feels that he has to defend Israel from certain end, there is no long-term solution without peace. And after probing, he said, and yes, with justice and equality. And I was very moved. And he took us to the children's house on the commune, and he took us underneath the children's house to the bomb shelter where he used to sleep as a child. This was last used in 2006 because of shelling from Hezbollah. The hills of Lebanon are directly beyond the border of the kibbutz. They are now being used again because of the wider war that's happening now. And he said, and I'll quote, "I have been so mind-fucked by all of this, and I want a different life for my kids." I want to tell one more time a visit we had in Israel, which was an amazing Israeli community that was intentionally started in 1967 after the occupation of Palestine. And the goal was to have an equal number of Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Israelis living together in this community. There's now 150 families. As equals, as neighbors, as partners. And I learned there that the school system in Israel, the public school system, is completely segregated. And they created a private school that was integrated of Palestinian Israelis and Jewish Israelis, and it was the first one in the country. Now there are 7 private schools that do this, but the segregation of education is huge. But even the education of Palestinian Israelis is controlled by the Israeli state, and you're not allowed to talk about the Nakba in school. You're not allowed to talk about a lot of Palestinian history in school, but these private schools can be more honest and deep. And I love, there's an on the wall picture of the village and their symbol mixing the 2 flags, which is very meaningful. And we talked for a long time with Rita. And she is the elected mayor of the town, and she's a Palestinian mayor. She's lived in this town for 33 years and raised her kids there. And she talked about some of the challenges and struggles, including close by Israeli Jewish communities sometimes come by and do vandalism and harass them. Even though there are Jews in this community, they don't like them living with Palestinian Israelis. And just one thing, we met this lovely Rabbi Bernstein who came to the Oasis of Peace community because of Maria, who knew him, and she was on our delegation. He is the rabbi of a kibbutz within 10 minutes of the Oasis of Peace, and he had never visited before. So it was so great to see Rita and Steve talking, listening to each other. I had a great talk with him about different kinds of Zionism, whether he thought Israel had created an apartheid regime. And it's like, when I go back again, he has invited me to come to his kibbutz and be his guest, and I can't wait. So the question is, after all of this trip, what is ours to do back home? Then the delegation, we knew that we would give a gift. This is Reina, who is the head of school for the Ramallah Friends School, and David Small, who's the clerk of the Atlanta Friends meeting, gave her a quilt made by people in Atlanta. And then over on the right, you have the delegation going to a really fantastic bar in Ramallah on one of our last nights, discussing what is our to do back home. Oh. So we came to sort of agreement and clarity on 3 key action ideas that are broad that I want to share with you. Educate our congregations, communities, and country about the problems of US-backed Israeli apartheid, or you could use another word, but it would mean roughly the same, and it's being an obstacle to sustainable peace. Lobby to change US foreign policy towards a genuine concern for human rights, peace, and diplomacy instead of massive military aid to Israel. And support all nonviolent civil society efforts in Israel, Palestine, the US, and around the world, pushing for peace, justice, and equality for everyone living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. We also talked about apartheid-free community, which is the new network of congregations, denominations, and organizations who sign a pledge to work against the system of apartheid and allow something better to emerge in the Holy Land. And this is their pledge. You could consider if your congregations want to join it, and I'll just let people kind of quickly read, and then I'll move on to the current situation. So then Hamas attacked Israeli civilians on October 7th. And it was a mass slaughter. And I unequivocally condemn it. Hamas is a violent, right-wing, authoritarian, rather perverse interpretation of Islam. They are brutal to gay people. They are hard on Palestinian women, and many within their military wing do have fantasies of taking over all of historic Palestine and even kicking out the Jews who live there. And then there's these people, pictures of people who have been captured or killed by their attack. This is so wrong. So what would have been a moral and strategic response? I didn't used to have this part in the talk, but people have been demanding, okay, what would be your alternative for what Israel and the US are doing? And I think it comes from the heart of the prophetic Jewish tradition, this Psalm 34:14, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. What would that mean in this situation? I think and people might disagree with me, but I think it's reasonable for the state of Israel to stop the immediate threat of the Hamas military wing through military self-defense, which they have through the Iron Dome anti-missile system, which protects them, and they have now not enough troops at the border that push them back into Gaza. So the immediate threat is gone. Take time to grieve and deliberate and consider what would avoid the world seeing Israelis' response as bad or worse than the Hamas attack, and win and maintain world sympathy and support. Negotiate with third-party help for a hostage and prisoner exchange. Decrease the minimal support that Hamas has, which public opinion polling in Palestine suggests is only about 20% among Palestinians, and make real moves towards ending the occupation and the apartheid regime from the river to the sea as a way to lessen even that minimal support that Hamas has. Negotiate with the leaders of the 80% of Palestinians who don't support Hamas and do support, do support peace with justice. And I also think it's reasonable for a time for Israel to maintain certain self-defense measures at its internationally recognized borders until trust and peace measures improve conditions. But what is the current strategy? We all know what it is. Attack 2.2 million people, keep them from having food, water, electricity, medicine, communications, and fuel. To displace 1 million people and to bomb them indiscriminately. And now a ground invasion. I believe, and many organizations around the world, including Jewish peace groups, Christian peace groups, major Quaker groups, believe that we need to de-escalate the current crisis and address the underlying conflict for a just peace. Ceasefire now, release of the captives, restore humanitarian aid. These are the immediate things. And then to do the hard work to change the underlying structures of power to create equality and justice for all. I want to thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry I went over. I would love to have Q&A, and I've put up my email address in case we don't get to everybody's question or comment. And also this talk is a work in progress, and so please write me if you have suggestions about how I can make it more useful and loving as we go. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can talk together.
Thank you, Steve. Very, very helpful for this heartfelt report. Are there questions?
David, I have a question. Are we leaving the recording on during the questions, or do you want me to stop it?
If it's all right with everyone, we'll keep it on. Is it all right?
Yeah, no objections.
Okay, no objections. So keep it on, please.
I will.
So any questions, people that are here remotely? Is that a hand?
Hi there, this is Monique. Oh,
Great.
was somebody
Yeah.
else talking? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Go right ahead.
Oh, okay. I want to say that I really appreciate the presentation, Steve, and your life's work to do this work and to go and to seek out some form of justice and peace in this part of the world. I guess for me, I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but for me, it just feels completely abhorrent to ask for peace when there's been no justice. And I guess I don't see this. I know there are differences, and there's probably a lot of differences, but there's a huge amount of similarities between Indigenous Palestinians being displaced and ongoing genocide, and Native American or other Indigenous people here in the Americas, in Africa. You know, we just read last year, I guess, Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, as a meeting many of us did. And it's just, this is exactly what happened with Black folks, what's happening with Black folks in our country and in a lot of places around the world, that there is no sense of justice. And I have such a hard time with our peace testimony in this sense, because I feel we should be asking Israel for peace. I feel we should be asking the United States government for peace. And it's just, you know, we should be asking these imperialist corporations for peace. And it just feels so one-sided to constantly criticize any form of self-defense that Indigenous or Black people take for themselves as like a terrorist move. It's really hard for me to ask for peace in that way, and especially when I just, from my point of view, that all we are doing is using Israel anyways as a strategic, you know, military plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's I don't think the United States lawmakers really care about anti-Semitism or the well-being of Jewish people. I feel like it's just there for military purposes so that we can reign as an imperialist, you know, country or powerhouse. And it just feels crazy to ask for peace, other than to tell our government to get out of it, you know, to stop funding this war.
Yeah. If
I
I
don't know
could,
if
I
you
would
see
love
those
to
similar.
comment. In 1964, Malcolm X gave an amazing speech called Ballots or Bullets. And he said something that I empathized with so much. And he said he had just explained why he felt like we should use guns, Molotov cocktails, why we should burn cities down. After doing an amazing political analysis and a strong vision for a really multicultural, just democracy. But then he's talking about what kinds of action steps to take. And he said something that I think is so revealing and that we need as Quakers to have empathy with, which is, I have been so traumatized by centuries of white supremacist violence against Black bodies that you have driven me insane, and I am no longer responsible for my actions. And I think we have to empathize with that. And in the same way go, well, we have to also think strategically and how to win and how to draw from the deepest spiritual depths, even under that trauma, that we reach for being responsible for our actions, for being as humane as we can be, but to always, always push for justice in what we, in our best judgment of what will make the most sense. I've tried to lay out what I think might move us forward. But I also understand I want to address Israel and the United States as well, because as Martin Luther King said, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in our globe. And I don't want to finger point and, nag Palestinians for, genuine reflecting to Quaker pacifism. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think we each have to think about how do we take moral responsibility, how do we move things forward, and how do we put our shoulder to the wheel to change US and Israel policy.
Thank you, Monique and Steve. Other questions? Yeah, Sheila.
Yeah, Steve, thank you so much. I'm going to lose it too. I really appreciate your honest expression of emotion, because it's so emotional, and I'm just so grateful for this presentation. My question is, how do we access the recorded version of this? Because I have half of my family is Jewish, and some of them are out on the streets in New York City, and some of them don't want to talk to me at all, or they want to say, well, we don't really know how many Palestinians have died, and things like that. And I lost it with my sister yesterday, and I want to just call her up and just cry and say, you got to listen to this, you got to. So how do we do that?
Well, Stefan is recording it, and
Yeah.
as soon as I find out where it is, I will post it. Are you on the San Francisco monthly meeting friends list?
No.
Do you get those emails?
No, but
He
I'm
lives
in
from
Vermont. I'm a member of Steve's old meeting.
Well, could you email Peace and Social Concerns?
Yeah. Or if you know Steve, Steve will have it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can
We
get
can
it
share
through
it.
you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll certainly email Steve the link so that we all can share it, because there were a lot of
Right.
people that wanted to come.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
Eileen has her hand up, but
Eileen.
Thank you, friends, for making this available to those of us different places. And thank you, Steve. I also don't have a question, but a comment, and I hope that's okay, because it feels like there's so much bubbling up. But I want to respond to the earlier comment about nonviolence, and kind of build on what Steve's response was. I was actually on one of the first delegations to Palestine in 1988, the first one organized by the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee during the Intifada, which, as Steve said, the first one was mostly nonviolent. And that was actually the experience that convinced me in the power of nonviolence, and was an important on my becoming a Quaker. I was in the middle of graduate school studying colonialism in Africa. I had, as an undergraduate, like my senior thesis was comparing political violence in Northern Ireland and Palestine. And now I work more on Indigenous issues here. So I really, really appreciate where that first comment came from. And the way that I think about it is like, kind of as Steve was saying, like, it's our tax dollars going to the United States, which are going to Israel. So of course, the primary challenge here is to those with the biggest guns and the biggest armies, right? We have to I have the biggest voice in challenging that, and biggest moral responsibility. And those are the people with the most power. So what I take from that comment is we have to be careful not to blame the people who are the recipients of violence more than the perpetrators of violence. And still, I've become convinced over the years that many struggles for freedom would have been won earlier and with less trauma had freedom fighters stuck to nonviolence. It's not my job to judge, but it's sort of like my understanding of history. And it was particularly true in Israel, Palestine. What struck me was, especially when the next Intifada was very violent, that the biggest difference I see between Israel and those other cases is that so many Jews went there out of trauma. and out of the violence of the Holocaust, and that was so foundational to the founding of Israel that I mean, if you could, run an experiment, I would be really curious how long people could stand just a nonviolent movement, and the ways that Palestinian violence, when it happens, has been used to justify this extreme reaction, part of which I think comes out of trauma, and part of which is totally manipulated by the Israeli government to justify whatever they want to do. So I think in this moment of having discussion, that's something that's really hard, that I'm trying to sit with, like an understanding that there is real trauma in the Jewish experience, and also it's being manipulated by the people with power. So I just wanted to name that to me is what makes this issue so much harder than talking about Ojibwe land rights, or South Africa or Northern Ireland even. So I guess, Steve, I'm curious if you have a comment about that, but that's what I wanted to share.
Yeah. I'm here at Pendle Hill, and there was just this amazing group of grassroots organizers, various people of color, and I spent some time with a woman who actually lives in DC. So I think she and I are going to become friends, and we agreed that we were going to go see Rustin together. But she was sort of feeling like maybe, as painful as it was, Hamas was justified in doing what they did. And she asked me what I thought. And I raised the ballots and bullets thing, and she knew that speech really well. And I explained that ballots and bullets are 2 out of 3 possible choices. And ballots are useful, but they are not sufficient in extreme situations of domination. Political violence, armed struggle can sometimes win, but I work for the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and we sponsored some of the most amazing research by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, and they wrote a book in 2011 called Why Civil Resistance Works. And nonviolent civil resistance is that third alternative that Malcolm didn't even consider. And what they found, by comparing 334 cases over a 100-year period of people's movements fighting dictatorship, foreign occupation, and for national succession, to have a minority be able to be freer and not oppressed, the hardest cases possible. And they coded whether they were largely based on a strategy of armed struggle or largely based on civil resistance, strikes, boycotts, protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, throwing wrenches into the machine through putting your bodies on the line. A lot like what Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now is so masterfully doing, and we really have to have those people's backs. But anyway, what they found was, looking at that, nonviolent civil resistance was twice as effective as armed struggle. Even failed nonviolent civil resistance would more likely yield a democratic outcome 5 years from now than failed armed struggles. The time it takes to win a struggle through armed struggle, on average, out of all those cases, was 9 years. The amount of time it took on average to win through disciplined, strategic civil resistance was 3 years. A lot less people died in nonviolent civil resistance, and the repression, though it was real and harsh, was less by many factors, many powers, than what happened to people sympathetic to the armed struggle. And it included 10 times more % of the population than armed struggle. So there is a moral case to be made, but there's also an empirical strategic case to be made that if we want to win, we need to think seriously about nonviolent resistance combined with elections and combined with diplomacy.
Thank you. I have two quick questions, or maybe quick. One is, for the Palestinians who've suffered so long under occupation and all the violence that you've shared so passionately, what keeps them going? What gives them hope? And keeping struggling. And the
Can I
second
answer that and then you ask the second one?
Who wants to answer first?
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
So there was a member of our delegation that asked every single Palestinian we talked to that question. And there were different responses. One person said, please don't ever ask a Palestinian about hope. We do what we do to try to stay alive, to try to find freedom, and we may or may not get there, but we have to do it, whether we're hopeful or pretty despairing. And I think that's one answer. The other people often talked about what they call long hope. When we were with Hannah Shrawi, she said, the way I look at it, the two solution, and I'm not sure I agree, but that was her position. And it's too early for the democratic one state where everybody has equal rights and can vote. It's a dilemma. It's a dilemma partially because they don't have support from the US population pushing their government hard enough to become actually useful in this situation instead of destructive. And there's various ways we can help out without taking a position on one state or two state as a solution. The Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, it has potential power as a global civil society movement that we're engaging in the same actions that were used fairly successfully by global civil society and some governments to push South Africa to a crisis point where it was able to negotiate and, for all the problems that still exist, move beyond formal apartheid. So hope is a complicated thing. And I think we have to help as much as possible to keep hope alive for the traumatized young people. Gaza is 50%, 2.2 million people, and 50% of them are under 18 years of age. And think what they've lived through. We need to take responsibility to be allies and to be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The other question is, given what's happened since October 7th, in terms of the Israeli response to the violent attack by Hamas, do you feel that among Palestinians, West Bank and Gaza, there may be a feeling, well, that really didn't work. Look what we have suffered as a result of that violent attack. And maybe we really need to engage more fully and powerfully in nonviolent struggle.
That's a great question. I think the sad thing is when you attack an entire population of over 2 million people and you displace them, you bomb them, you starve them, you keep them from having enough water or medicine, you're going to have, think about the rage and the desire for retaliation that emerged when 1,200 Israeli civilians were killed. Now imagine that rage and that sense of retaliation that will be expanding. And this is why I think that what is currently being done by the US in Israel is not in the interests of Israelis. It is this fantasy notion that they will destroy Hamas militarily. This fantasy notion that even if they killed all the military wing of Hamas by accident while they were bombing everybody else, Hamas 2.2 could exist. They're not going to be able to have peace and security for themselves without moving towards justice. And I have talked with people at the Sabeel Palestinian Christian Liberation Theology Center, and they are saying they're nervous because they're seeing a percentage of young people, given the horrors of what's happening, are going, oh, see, we tried nonviolence, it didn't work, which is a weird fallacy when violence has been tried and it's behaving so bad, but it's very, very common. And so that's another reason that moving towards ceasefire, minimizing the damage, showing international concern and a horizon of hope for Palestinian young people is in the benefit of Palestinians, but frankly, it's in the security interests of Israeli civilians as well.
Thank you, Steve. Other questions? People are here or online?
I'd like to ask one more quick question and just note that I put in the chat a couple of books that I would recommend people reading. So check there if you're interested. My question is strategic, since we've been using the word strategy a lot, and I'm all in favor of it. Steve, what is your strategy for reaching US politicians? Because I live in Vermont, which is one of the most progressive states in the Union, and nobody dares say ceasefire. Not even Bernie Sanders, for God's sake.
He's
Something's
inching
going
there.
on.
He's inching there, and even Jamie
He's
Rasmussen
inching,
is
but
inching
not
there.
even inching, quarter inching.
Yeah.
So what would
know,
you?
you have to
how
keep
would you
pushing.
approach
You keep pushing the wheel. More and more people are signing on to the House bill, and that's because of pressure.
Yeah.
People being in the streets, people lobbying. There's a lot of good resources and Friends Committee on National Legislation.
And
I also think
too,
how we
has
do
the
things
weekly-
matter. We need to be clear that we stand up for space for public dialogue and public protest, because I experienced that last week when I gave a talk at the Claremont, New Jersey Public Library, which my talk had been canceled once. It was rescheduled at the library after the UU Church wouldn't allow me to speak, and people tried to cancel me at the library. I gave my talk. There were people in the audience who were wanting to continue the Israeli war against 2.2 million Gazans, and they tried to shout me down and wouldn't let me talk, called me a hate monger, an anti-Semite. And there's an organized reaction to keep us from deliberating together and sharing our hearts and thinking. So we have to push for space for that and do political education wherever we can. The other thing that I think is really important is the war is coming home. The war is coming home. The amount of Islamophobia, anti-Arab bigotry, and anti-Jewish bigotry and hate crimes, we as Quakers have a role to say, no, we have to stand in solidarity of anybody who's being victimized in that way, even if we disagree with them. Doesn't mean they should be harmed or killed. So I think it's building a social movement. And I just want to say again, because Montclair example in New Jersey, there were 8 different co-sponsors of my talk. One of them was Jewish Voice for Peace, and they were routinely singled out by this small group in Montclair. It said they were run by Iran, that they were a hate group, that they loved what Hamas did, that they're anti-Semitic, and they're not really Jews anyway. They're mostly, pretend Jews who are Christians, and just scurrilous things that were wrong and false. And they kept saying, well, the Anti-Defamation League says this is true about Jewish Voice for Peace. And I saw firsthand the kind of repression and discrimination against some of the most brave and moral people who are offering leadership in this peace movement, and we have to have their backs.
Barry, did you want to speak?
Jerry, go ahead.
Thanks all, and I apologize if this was already covered. I wasn't able to be here earlier. And it's great to see you, Steve. Was wondering about your comments that you think Bernie Sanders is moving closer. I have seen no evidence about that, and apologies if you said this earlier. I'd love to know what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, his rhetoric was good for a mainstream Democrat, but we expect more from him. At least I do, and I think many people here do. But he has been nuancing things, and it's been getting better because of pressure. And it was great. Yesterday, I got an email from the organization he founded, Our Revolution, which said very directly, we need to support Barbara Lee because she's the only California senatorial candidate who's for ceasefire. And so he is feeling the milieu around him shifting. And so many people of, quotes, the squad and progressive Democrats are pushing him. And I don't quite know what his lingering resistance is, but I think it matters. I mean, we now have 2 Jewish congresspeople who have signed on to the ceasefire. They weren't the original co-signers of it, but because of this Tomei, and I think because of the leadership of, if not now, Center for Jewish Nonviolence and Jewish Voice for Peace, there's dialogues going on in the Jewish community, sometimes painful, but sometimes moving things forward, that there are shifts. And I just don't think this is a time to give into the sin of despair. I think this is the time for us to go, let us see what love can do, and push and see what the possibilities are. Because if we don't do anything because we assume nothing can change, nothing will change. If we assume that things might change and act accordingly, that increases the chances.
I have one more question, Steve.
Go right ahead, David.
And that is, are there people in Palestine and Israel or Israel that are really laying out a vision of what justice could really look like?
Yeah.
Justice and peace in Palestine and Israel that could be a rallying cry for people of goodwill on both sides there and around the world to support that vision.
Yes, there are. And I think nurturing those voices, because they sometimes have hard times in their own societies, and nurturing them and supporting them. On the Palestinian side, I talked about the Palestine National Initiative that Mustafa Baghardi, the party he's created, the Sabeel Center for Palestinian Christian Liberation Theology has done amazing thinking and thoughts, and constantly is making appeals to the world's Christians who go, why do you even forget that we're here? And why do you just continue to support your government? And they make appeals. There are sort of groups that I think there's a group in Israel called Stand Together, which is Palestinian Israeli and Jewish Israeli who are sick and tired of hurting each other and are articulating ways for coexistence and even in some cases co-resistance to have equality and justice for all. And so all around the world, there are seeds that need to be watered, that need to be planted, and that need to be tended.
Anything else? Well, thank you so much, Steve. Very,
Oh.
very, to all of us, and I'm sure that we know that it's been recorded and hopefully it can get shared very widely among friends and others around the
Thank
country.
you so much for this opportunity to speak with you all, and I really appreciate the comments and questions, and it has been an absolute joy to be with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Let's close
Ditto.
with silent worship. Let's hold the hostages and all the victims on both sides in the light and pray for justice and peace.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. May this unity and peace spread beyond our walls. Okay, that's it. Unless anybody has